And welcome back, students. Let's continue on to our next lesson. Today we're going to discuss in our topics of what a computer is by discussing the ideas of hardware and software. So let's define the differences between hardware and software to get started here. So with hardware, the definition of that is the mechanical, magnetic, electronic, and electrical devices comprising a computer system. Now, the easy way to remember what hardware is that it's the physical components of a computer. Therefore, you can physically touch it, unlike software. Like I can pick up a hard drive, I can touch it. I can pick up a motherboard, I can pick up a power supply. All those different things I can touch. Now, software, the definition of that is the set of instructions that actually allow the hardware to do the task that it's meant to do. Now, a thing to remember about software is that it's the complement for hardware. So hardware without software is pretty much useless, as both are needed for the component to really be functional. All right, now let's dive into some of the hardware of a personal computer. Now, when we talk about a desktop computer, there's typically three main components. You have a computer tower, you have a monitor, and the keyboard and mouse. Sometimes the tower and monitor will be integrated in what's called an all-in-one, which we'll talk about later, but those are typically the three main identifying components. Now, devices such as laptops or tablets will typically have all their components in one unit or the computer itself, because it's meant to be that way. Yes, they might be detachable, or you might have other things that you can attach to it, such as you can do like a wireless mouse, for example, but typically the computer is presented as is in a functional device. Additionally, external devices such as printers or webcams may also be present. So this goes for both laptops, tablets, desktops. You can hook what's called a peripheral up to the device in order to give it more functionality. Now, let's examine the main components of a computer regardless of type. So we're talking specifically about the tower here in this case. So the first component is what's known as the motherboard, and I have a picture that shows an example of what a motherboard is. The motherboard is the main printed circuit board. And when we say main printed circuit board, it means that it could be other circuit boards, but this is the main one. This is where everything is housed. Many of your crucial components, such as CPU and RAM, are also housed here. So when I say housed, that means that they are inserted into the motherboard. Right? They're components that are attached into there, whether it's through like some sort of snap system or it's a clip, whatever it is, they are inserted into that motherboard. Now, the motherboard will also contain slots which allows for expansions such as video cards, sound cards, network cards, etc. So you can have any kind of things that would fit into the slots. And those slots, of course, are right here. Right? These are typically your expansion slots. These right here are typically for memory, and this would be like your CPU. Those are the main things. These right here would be your cabinets that would then give you access to the stuff that we find in your back of your desktop. And then you might also have here someplace some connections for front ports. Now, with the motherboard, it typically will contain basic instructions for the computer known as BIOS. These basic instructions include usually like a very rudimentary operating system. So when you first turn the computer on, this is like when you first see like that logo of whatever your brand of computer is, for example, that is the BIOS booting up. So it has to go through BIOS first. Once BIOS loads, then it loads your operating system by looking at the different areas it can boot from. All right. Next is the central processing unit. It's a little chip that looks like this. If we flip it up the other way, typically you might have, the other side is usually a nice smooth metallic surface because that's where the fan is mounted. This side right here might also, instead of these little divots you see here, will have like pins. It just really depends on what kind of CPU you're using. Now, as I've kind of already alluded to, the central processing unit is commonly referred to as just the CPU. And in fact, when I talk about a CPU, this is what I'm referring to. I'm not going to say central processing unit every time because it's easier just to say CPU. Now, this component of the computer is referred to as the brain of the computer. And when we say it's the brain, that means that it's carrying out many of the arithmetic, logical, and input-output operations of the system. So a lot of those basic things happen here in the CPU. And there's different types of CPUs like dual core, quad core, hyper-threaded, all this different stuff. We're not going to worry about those different nuances. Instead, we're going to focus on just what is the CPU. Now, due to the vast amount of heat generated, because it's doing a lot of calculations really quickly, there's typically a large fan placed directly over the CPU to keep the temperature down, because otherwise it will literally overheat. There's other optional codes like water cooling and stuff. But let's go ahead and jump right to the next component, which is that of memory. All right, this right here is an example of a memory stick, specifically a DRAM of, I think this one here is one of the newer ones, or one of the older ones rather, because it's got a nick right here. The main type of memory in your computer, of course, is known as RAM, or random access memory. That's one of the big takeaways here that you need to know is what is RAM, because there are actually other types of memory, but the one that we're going to focus on is RAM, or random access. Now, with memory, it's typically used to store temporary instructions for the computer with very high transfer speeds. Compare like a RAM and how fast you can transfer information to that of your hard drive. Your hard drive is like a snail compared to that of a memory stick. Memory sticks are extremely fast. Hard drive, not so fast. Now, the trade-off for this is that it's very volatile. And because of the volatile nature, what this means is that if the power is shut off on the computer, or it's interrupted or anything like that, any information in RAM is lost. And this could be things like, for example, like when you copy something, it's in RAM. Or if you load up certain programs, they'll put some stuff temporarily in RAM. All right, next, let's talk about the power supply unit. This is the component of what supplies energy to the computer. Now, obviously, in a laptop or tablet, it looks a lot different from this because they have a different conversion ratio. A lot of times, when you plug those devices in, there'll be an adapter. They'll convert the necessary energy over. Desktops, you have a bigger unit like this. Now, sometimes you'll hear people refer to the power supply as the PSU, or power supply unit. So they're just kind of like the CPU, we just shorthand it. So if you ever hear PSU, it's power supply. Now, larger power supplies are needed for computers that require more energy. Now, just like with a laptop, same thing. If you have let's say a gaming laptop, you're probably going to have a larger conversion on it than if you had a desktop or a smaller little like netbook. Computers that typically have powerful graphic cards draw a lot more power and would require at least like a 500-watt power supply if we're talking about desktop computers. You can kind of get away with smaller ones, but you typically don't have as much computing power. You start looking at bigger ones. 500 watt is kind of a good standard rule of thumb of what they're using. Now, with the power supply, they typically will use a fan in order to vent heat generated from the temperature-sensitive computer. And the reason why they need vent heat from is because they're doing a lot of energy conversion. They're taking the alternating current that comes out of your wall socket and then converting it actually over to direct current, which is what the computer uses. Next, let's talk about storage. And there's actually two different types of primary storage here that we're going to talk about here. All right. This is the component that's used as a storage medium, which typically will contain things such as your operating system or any kind of data, such as pictures, music, movies, anything like that, games. Now, as I mentioned, there's two types. You have the hard disk drive, which is this right here, and the solid state drive. Now, with a hard disk, or a HDD, this is typically a metal disk that is coated with a magnetic surface for storing data. And this is an open one here. There would actually be a cover normally over top of this so you wouldn't see all the stuff here. But right here, this round circular platter right here, that's the disk right here. This right here sits on a rotator right here, and it'll spin at high speeds, and that is where your data actually gets stored, is on that disk. That disk is typically coated then with a magnetic surface, which is then used for storing data. Now, an interesting thing about a hard disk drive is that it's not stored front to back with your data, but instead it's random access. What that means is if you install something brand new, yes, it starts from the middle and kind of works its way out, but when you go and delete a file, let's say, it will then just delete out that chunk of file. Now, it doesn't keep adding on to the end. Instead, what happens when you go and install your next thing, it's going to fill that chunk that you took out. And if it's longer than a chunk, well, then the rest of it goes on to the end. Right? Now, the advantage of this means that data can be retrieved in any order. but not really sequentially. Downside of it is that because it's not kind of front to back and data can really get really quickly, especially in fragmented, all over your hard disk, that it can lead to longer retrieval times of information. Now let's compare that to the solid state drive. All right, there's no moving components in a solid state drive. It's all just electrical signal. You can think of this as like a big fancy kind of USB drive. Now, there's no spinning components or magnetic heads, because this right here, this piece on the hard disk, this right here, this is the arm. That's actually what does the writing. That's the magnetic head. So there's nothing like that that will read or write data. So the solid state, or SSD, is far more durable, and because it doesn't have to worry about moving components, it has faster access times. And when I say it's more durable, that doesn't mean it's impervious to damage. But if you drop a solid state drive and you drop a hard drive, the solid state drive is more likely to survive. Think about if you drop a flash drive, you just pick it up and it's still good. You drop a hard drive, maybe not so much, because you might, for example, you might damage one of the components inside. Like the head, for example, could scratch the platter, because typically it doesn't actually make contact, it hovers above it. So it could scratch the platter, something could snap inside of it, all these different things that could happen with a hard disk. Now, the trade-off of that, because obviously solid state is kind of superior in many regards, is that the cost of solid state is still far greater than that of a traditional hard drive. Traditional hard drive is a lot cheaper, solid state a lot more expensive. One thing to note that is an advantage of the hard drive that I don't have in here is that if you're looking at doing things for a long-term storage, like archiving purposes, you're probably going to want to use a hard drive or magnetic tape because they don't deteriorate. Solid state drives, the big downside of them is that they're only typically good for so many read writes. So other than that, let's move on. We have next the optical drive. Right. Optical drives are what allows the computer to read extra data from external source. So things like a CD-ROM, DVD-ROM, DVD-RW, and even Blu-ray combo drives. These are all different types of drives. You might see CD ones that aren't really very common anymore. You typically will still see DVD drives. And occasionally see like Blu-ray combo ones. Those are the most common ones you'll see now. Now the ROM part stands for read-only memory. This means that the data once written can only be accessed and cannot be changed. Now, if you see something like RW, that means rewritable. If you see just an R, that means recordable. Now, many forms of disk media, whether it's CDs, DVDs, Blu-rays, whatever, are being replaced by things like flash memory, such as a USB stick or SD card, due to that you can have far greater storage and faster transfer speeds, and it's a lot smaller. Think about the size of an SD card. It's very small compared to that of a CD or DVD. Now, additionally, digital storage and streaming have decreased the need for a physical drive to read media, as many applications are now stored in the cloud. Like, if you want to go and get something, you can just stream it. Like, you can load up like an app like Spotify or Pandora, and you can just listen to it. You can go to YouTube, just listen to it. You don't have to download something. You don't have to take a CD, put it in your tray, listen to the music to have it. It's all just digital. Additionally, like I said, digital storage is a pretty big thing, because now I can just put it right in, for example, in the cloud, like Google Drive, for example. I can put stuff in Google Drive, I can put stuff in OneDrive. I don't have to limit myself to a physical disk. All right, next, let's talk about expansion cards. These are often added to increase the performance of, or to give the computer access to something that's not included with the motherboard. Sound video cards are often integrated with the motherboard, but are not designed for high-performance tasks. So you can actually go and get a motherboard, and most of them come pretty standard with this now. It wasn't always the case, but standard is that you're going to have video and audio integrated into the motherboard. Now, the downside of this, of course, is, for example, video. You can get a dedicated video card, which is the most common expansion, typically to increase things like visual performance. So this is used largely in applications such as gaming or visual rendering for things such as CAD or Autodesk. Now, there is a distinct difference between a gaming card
and one that would be used for like CAD, because they have different functions of what they're trying to do. However, they're both can still be pretty powerful. Now, the other main type of card that we're going to talk about is a network card. And these are added to give a computer access typically to either a wired or a wireless network. Now, when I say a wired network, that means that the computer, let's say it's a desktop, and where you plug your Ethernet cable into the back, let's say that spot goes bad. Well, the computer doesn't have wireless, you could add a wireless card. But if you want to keep the wired capability, you can actually just buy another wire LAN card, and you can insert that into the computer. All right. Now, let's just quickly discuss what an input device is, because it's very important. This is one example of a peripheral. These are any devices that give the user input to the computer. So, quick example, keyboard and mouse. Now, the keyboard typically inputs characters to the computer, providing input. And when I say character, I'm referring to anything that is on your keyboard. Not just a letter, not just a number, but anything, such as a spacebar is a character. Hitting backspace is a character. Those, pretty much anything. Yes, they're both letters and numbers, but typically it's anything on your keyboard. Now, the mouse is an input device which interacts with the user's monitor to kind of give a visual direction of what the user wants to be clicked. So if you move your mouse, you click on it, something will happen. If you right-click, something else will happen, depending on whatever is mapped for that mouse function. Now, other input devices typically include things such as like graphic tablets, microphones, and even webcams. And you might be able to think of some other input devices that exist out there that may not be listed on the slide. It's pretty much if you're giving some kind of input, that's an input device. Such as like, let's say a school mobi is an input device. Now let's talk about output devices, which is its kind of partner. Output devices are the devices which give information back to the user. So remember, input is the user gives information to the computer. This is the computer gives information to the user. So examples include monitors, TVs, projectors, speakers, and even printers. Now the monitor will typically display visual information that the user can view and read. A printer will display information by printing it onto a sheet of paper or whatever medium you're printing to, post-it paper, whatever. Now speakers, obviously they're not printing off on a sheet of paper, they're not putting it on a screen, but instead they'll render the information in the form of sound. Now technically all output devices can print, quote unquote, to an external device to allow the user to, quote unquote, read it. Even a speaker, it's printing, but it's printing in the form of audio. Right? And how the user reads it is that we don't read it with our eyes, instead we hear it with our ears. So that's why I put it in quotes. So any kind of output device is where the computer, again, is taking that information and giving it to the user. All right, that's enough on hardware. Now let's talk about software. So what is the role of software? Now, hardware without software is really, at the end of the day, just a big fancy paperweight. The really only exception to this is that of firmware, which is specially designed software that is permanently part of the hardware. Remember, software contains the instructions for how the hardware will perform. And there are three kinds of software. You have system software, application software, and embedded software. All right, so let's first talk with system software, which is probably like the more important one. This is software that gives instructions directly to the hardware. And what I mean that is that it's designed to control the hardware, and it gives the user a platform from which to work on. So some examples of this would include things such as the operating system, which obviously allows parts of the computer to work together for tasks like data transfer, rendering to an output device, or run high-level system software and application software. You also have utility software. This helps to analyze, configure, optimize, and maintain the computer. This would be things such as your antivirus programs, things like your let's say CCleaner, which is a utility software, any kind of thing which kind of looks to maintain the computer to keep it in an optimized state is typically regarded as utility software. Or even something like WinRAR or 7-zip, those kind of applications which compress files are considered utility software because they're using something that interacts with the system, not ultimately giving the user a different kind of experience. And we'll talk about that in a second. And then you have device drivers, which are the computer BIOS, and firmware, which can provide basic functionality
to allow control over the hardware of the computer. This includes things such as like your display drivers, or maybe you have like an audio driver or something like that. These are those kind of software. Next, let's talk about application software. These are your quote-unquote apps. So this is what a lot of people think of when they think of software. It's like if you ask them to define it, they'll think about application software or apps. All right, application software allows your user to complete useful tasks beyond merely running the computer, such as browsing, gaming, etc. If you think about like listening to music, you're probably using an app for that, whether it's iTunes, Spotify, whatever. Now, while the web has also created something what's known as a web app, which is just an application that runs in your browser, there's still a need for traditional applications, as there are still advantages of being able to utilize the physical hardware of the PC. And that's one of the downside of playing something in your web browser, is that it's really limited to the capabilities of the browser. And browsers typically can access some CPU and some RAM. Maybe that's about it. And they don't get the full ability to utilize the hardware efficiently. Like they can't access, for example, like a GPU very well, if at all. All right, and lastly, let's talk about embedded software. This is software that's typically used to control devices not thought of as traditional computers. Due to its range and complexity, embedded software is found in a wide range of applications, such as cars, telephones, appliances, toys, and digital watches. Now, one thing known about embedded software is often interchangeably used with the term firmware. However, there is a slight difference in that the differences between embedded software and firmware is that firmware will have low-level control over the hardware. All right, so it allows us to manage the hardware to update it, whereas embedded software kind of is one and the same. All right, that's the end of the notes. I'm going to pause the video here, and I guess we will see you next time.